There was no point pretending this rollout still looked healthy. By this stage, the excitement around Iceman had shifted into something else entirely. It was no longer anticipation. It was relief that the version people had been sold was finally collapsing under its own weight. After all the teasing, all the dramatic build-up, and all the promises that this project would shake up hip-hop, the reality looked far less grand. It looked broken. That was the wild part. For months, the story around this album had been that it would mark some huge turning point. It was supposed to be the answer, the response, the masterstroke, the move that would re-establish Drake as the dominant force and remind everyone why his supporters had stayed loyal. But instead of momentum, there was confusion. Instead of confidence, there was visible hesitation. And instead of a clear path to release, there was a growing pile of warning signs. Even the people who had been giving him every benefit of the doubt were starting to run out of excuses. Because how long could the same trick keep working? How many times could the same artist hint at a project, preview a direction, stir up his bass, and then fail to deliver anything solid before the crowd started asking the obvious question? Was there ever really a plan here? That question had become impossible to ignore. The rollout no longer felt delayed. It felt damaged. And the deeper this situation went, the harder it became to argue otherwise. Because this was not just a normal setback. This was starting to look like an artist who had spent nearly 2 years circling an idea without ever truly landing on one. And that was only the beginning. Because the album itself was not the only thing falling apart. The person behind it seemed to be unraveling too. The biggest issue was not simply that Iceman had been pushed back. Artists delay albums all the time. That alone does not mean disaster. The real problem was what the delay appeared to reveal. It exposed something far worse than bad timing. It suggested that Drake did not actually know what this album was supposed to be. That was the part that stood out. This was not a rushed mixtape thrown together in a few weeks. This was a project that had been hanging over the conversation for a long time. It had been teased, referenced, and inflated to the point where it started to feel larger than the music itself. Singles had floated around. Snippets had emerged. Hints had been dropped. The name Iceman had been treated like it carried some deep significance. Yet after all that time, where was the vision? The answer seemed painfully simple. There wasn't one. Because when the leaks started surfacing, what did they actually suggest? Not a tightly focused concept album. Not a carefully crafted body of work with one strong emotional or artistic direction. What they pointed to was something much messier. A collection of songs. Different moods. Different sounds. A handful of tracks that felt like trend chasing, a few that sounded like emotional venting, and others that seemed designed more for social media reaction than album cohesion. That was not a grand statement. That was a floating playlist with expensive branding. And that disconnect mattered. Drake had framed this era like it was strategic, like every move was part of a bigger design. The implication was that when the album finally arrived, all the confusing pieces would suddenly click into place. Supporters held onto that idea for dear life. They kept saying the same thing. Just wait. It would all make sense later. He had a plan. He knew what he was doing. But the longer this dragged on, the more that defense started to sound like wishful thinking. Because a real plan usually becomes clearer over time. This one only became more chaotic. That chaos was not limited to the music either. It spilled into the way songs were being handled behind the scenes. And once that side of the story surfaced, the whole situation started looking even worse. There had already been a reputation forming around how Drake's unreleased music moved through the world. That reputation was not flattering. The suggestion, repeated often enough to stick, was that his circle operated loosely. Too loosely. Songs reached too many ears too early. Snippets floated around in strange places. Unreleased material ended up in hands it never should have reached. And that kind of sloppiness always comes with a price. That price seemed to be hitting all at once. One of the more telling claims attached to this whole mess was that Drake had a habit of sharing unreleased songs in casual ways, sometimes just to impress people, sometimes without enough control over where the music would go afterward. Whether every detail of that claim was perfectly accurate did not even matter as much as the larger point. Too many pieces of unreleased material had escaped. Too many fragments were circulating. Too many people outside the core creative process appeared to have access. For some artists, leaks can be useful. They can test the waters. They can create buzz. They can even help shape a final track list if an artist wants to read the room. But that only works when the artist is comfortable with the risk. Drake, by contrast, had made it clear before that he did not like unfinished or unreleased songs escaping into the public. He wanted control over how and when music was heard. That made the situation around Iceman even more damaging. If he disliked leaks that much, then this was not a small nuisance. This was a direct threat to the entire rollout. And once songs start leaking from multiple points, paranoia follows fast. Which track is safe? Which version is compromised? Which studio session led to that snippet getting out? Who can still be trusted? The more that happens, the harder it becomes to move like an artist with confidence. Suddenly, every unfinished song feels contaminated. Every preview feels risky. Every next step feels reactive rather than intentional. That was where Iceman seemed to be stuck. It was not just delayed by ordinary creative indecision. It was being strangled by a messy ecosystem where unreleased material could no longer be protected. And then the story took an even darker turn because this was no longer just about leaks. This was about extortion. This question sat at the center of the entire mess, and no amount of spin could erase it. If Drake truly believed in Iceman, if the album was really that strong, and if the hackers had not already put the whole thing out, then why not release it immediately? That would have solved so much. It would have robbed the leakers of leverage. It would have taken back control of the narrative. It would have turned chaos into urgency and given Drake a chance to frame the release on his own terms. Even a surprise drop, even a quick pivot, would have made sense if the music was ready and the artist was confident. But he did not do that. That silence said more than any official statement could. It suggested hesitation, fear even, because a confident artist under pressure often responds by stepping forward. An uncertain one buys time. He stalls. He reshuffles. He blames circumstances. He returns to the drawing board. That seemed to be exactly what was happening here. The hacking issue may have been real, but it did not explain the deeper reluctance. That reluctance looked tied to the music itself. Maybe Drake knew the album would not land the way it needed to. Maybe he knew it would not restore what had been lost. Maybe he understood that all the teasing had created expectations the songs could not meet. That possibility made the delays look less like strategy and more like avoidance. Like a basketball player dribbling out the clock because he does not trust a shot. Like someone circling the stage but refusing to step into the spotlight. The album became a promise he could keep postponing because the fantasy of the comeback was safer than the reality of proving it. And in a strange way, that fantasy was all some supporters had left. The idea that one day Iceman would arrive and reset everything. One album, one moment, one release that would make the doubters look foolish and bring Drake back to the center. But the longer it was delayed, the more that dream started looking mythical rather than realistic. That mattered because the industry around him was not standing still. This was one of the strangest parts of the whole saga. If Drake truly had enough material to build and scrap 3 different versions of Iceman, then there should have been plenty of music available to keep his momentum alive in other ways. He did not need to trap everything inside one mythical album. He could have adapted. He could have released a short EP. He could have dropped a few targeted singles. He could have tested a more lyrical direction on one track, a more commercial angle on another, and rebuilt public trust step by step. In quieter months, even a modest project from someone with his profile could have commanded attention. There was room in the market. There were openings. There were chances to regain ground. But that was not the path he seemed to choose. Instead, the focus stayed stuck on build-up, teasing, posturing, posting, keeping the idea of Iceman alive rather than giving people something concrete to hold on to. That created an odd imbalance where the image work appeared more active than the music work. The branding stayed visible, but the artistic direction stayed blurry. And that is a dangerous game for any artist, especially one trying to recover from a public stumble. Because eventually fans stop feeding on hints. They want proof. They want songs that feel finished. They want a reason to believe there is still urgency behind the name. Without that, the rollout starts feeling like a shell around missing content. That was why the criticism became so harsh. If this album was truly the most important musical moment of his life, why did the execution around it look so improvised? Why did the release plan feel less serious than the stakes? Why did the project keep getting rebuilt instead of delivered in some form? Those questions did not have flattering answers. The most obvious one was also the harshest. Drake was not holding the album because it was brilliant. He was holding it because he could not figure out how to make it convincing. And by then, the word cooked was not just internet slang. It was a diagnosis. At this point, the simplest explanation looked like the strongest one. Iceman, in the form people had been sold, was finished before it ever truly began. Whether hackers made the situation worse or merely exposed what was already broken, the outcome felt the same. The album was not coming anytime soon, and the version once hyped as a defining statement had clearly fallen apart. That was the cold truth underneath all the noise. If Drake were truly ready, he would have shown it. Maybe not with the full album, but with something. A single, a decisive move, a sign of creative life strong enough to cut through the uncertainty. Instead, there was hesitation, revision, and the growing impression that the album had become a burden rather than a weapon. And that said everything, because the issue was no longer just timing. It was confidence. It was identity. It was whether Drake still knew how to present himself as the central force in rap without leaning on old formulas and endless anticipation. Iceman was supposed to answer that. Instead, it made the question even louder. For supporters still waiting, that was the hardest part. Expectations had to be lowered. The mythical comeback album was not standing around the corner ready to save the day. The rollout itself had admitted as much. Too many versions, too many leaks, too much confusion, too many signs that the artist behind it was still searching for a direction he should have found long ago. And for everyone watching from the outside, this was the real spectacle. Not just an album delay, but a superstar struggling to hold together the idea of himself while the music meant to restore that image kept slipping through his hands. That was why the situation felt so revealing. Not because it confirmed one small rumor, but because it exposed a larger truth. The rollout had become a mirror. It reflected the uncertainty, the fear, the indecision, and the fading illusion of total control. So for now, Iceman remains exactly what it has been for a long time. More promise than product, more talk than statement, more myth than music. And unless something changes fast, that might end up being its legacy. Remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't.